The Mughal emperors had fought countless wars across India, from the northern plains to the Deccan Bay salt hills, but few defeats cut as deep as those dealt by the Marathas. Among all their setbacks, one stands out as the most bitter, the most humiliating. How did an empire that ruled from Kabul to the Bay of Bengal find itself humbled by mountain horsemen? What tactics turned imperial discipline into desperation? The answer lies in a battle that rewrote the art of Indian warfare and the fate of the Deccan itself. That curiosity will be answered right away. But before we march into battle, welcome to Heroic History, where we explore the battles, leaders, and decisions that shaped the world. If you're new here, join our march by subscribing, because history is best when we ride together. And for this campaign, let's see if we can storm past 1,500 likes in the first 24 hours. A victory worthy of Shivaji himself. Now let's return to 1672 across the blazing Deccan Plateau, where two powers stood at their height. The Mughal Empire, vast and disciplined, faced the Marathas, heirs to Shivaji Maharaj's vision and masters of hill forts and swift cavalry. This was no mere contest for forts or tribute, but a battle for India's destiny. The 17th century in India was an age of contest where the fate of kingdoms was determined not only on the battlefield, but in the shifting balances of power between emperors, sultans, and ambitious new warlords. At its center lay the Deccan Plateau, a rugged land of basalt hills, deep valleys, and soaring fortresses that seemed to grow from the rock itself. Whoever held the Deccan held the key to southern India, and by extension to the revenues of the subcontinent, its richest trade routes. It was here that the Mughal Empire, the greatest imperial machine of Asia in its day, collided with the rising power of the Marathas, a people whose story was still being written in dust, blood, and fire. By the mid-1600s, the Mughals had already expanded their dominion far beyond the Gangetic plains, subduing Rajput states in the north, incorporating Bengal and Gujarat into their wealth, and pressing their banners steadily southward. Akbar had begun the process by breaking the independence of Ahmadnagar at the turn of the 17th century. Jahangir and Shah Jahan had tightened their grip further, yet full control eluded them. For the Deccan was no soft plain, but a land defended by hill forts and stubborn dynasts. Among these defenders emerged a force unlike the old sultanates, the Marathas. The Marathas were not a state in the traditional sense, nor a kingdom with neat borders and established courts. They were rather a movement born from the Jagirdars, peasant warriors and chieftains of western Maharashtra, who had long lived under the shadow of larger powers. What united them in the mid-17th century was the leadership of Shivaji Bhosale, later known to history as Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. His vision was revolutionary, that the Marathas, bound by their language, their traditions, and their devotion to the rugged Sahyadri hills, could form a state of their own, independent of both the Mughal emperors and the old Deccan sultans. Shivaji's rise during the 1640s and 1650s had transformed the political landscape. With daring raids, surprise attacks, and the lightning mobility of his cavalry, he outwitted forces many times his size. Fort after fort fell into his hands, either through audacity or clever negotiation. At Torna, Rajgad, and later Raigad, he built the strongholds that became symbols of his power. His most dramatic act came in 1659, when he ambushed and killed Afzal Khan, the general of the Bijapur Sultanate, at the foot of Pratapgarh, an act that electrified the Deccan and announced the Marathas as a force no ruler could ignore. By the 1660s, Shivaji's clashes had shifted from the Deccan sultanates to the Mughals themselves. Aurangzeb, who had just ascended the Mughal throne in 1658, viewed Shivaji as a bandit chieftain, threatening the stability of his southern provinces. Yet, Shivaji proved more than a mere nuisance. In 1664, he stormed the wealthy Mughal port of Surat, carrying off immense treasure and humiliating imperial prestige. The Mughals retaliated with overwhelming force. In 1665, faced with the campaign of Raja Jai Singh of Amber, Shivaji agreed to the Treaty of Purandar, ceding some forts but retaining his autonomy. The uneasy truce did not last. Shivaji's imprisonment in Agra in 1666 and his daring escape disguised in fruit baskets became legendary. By the 1670s, he had returned to Maharashtra, reclaiming forts and raiding Mughal convoys with renewed ferocity. His coronation as Chhatrapati at Raigad in 1674 symbolized the transformation of the Maratha movement into a kingdom in its own right. The Mughals, however, could not let this challenge go unanswered. For Aurangzeb, the Deccan had always been the theatre where imperial glory would be won or lost. For Shivaji, it was a war of survival and destiny. The road to Salher was paved in these escalating confrontations. After his return from Agra, Shivaji directed his commanders to harass Mughal garrisons and seize strategic strongholds across the Nashik and Baglan regions, gateways that connected northern Maharashtra to Gujarat. Salher and Mulher, two imposing forts in the Satmala range, guarded these approaches. Control of them meant access to the lucrative trade routes that linked Surat to the Deccan interior. In 1671, the Marathas under Shivaji's General Prataprao Gujar and Morapant Pingal pressed hard against Mughal positions in the Baglan region. Raids and skirmishes bled the Mughal garrisons, who struggled to maintain supply lines across hostile terrain. Alarmed, the Mughal Subahdars appealed for reinforcements. Aurangzeb, though occupied with other fronts, recognized the threat and dispatched a large force northward. By early 1672, the situation escalated into full-scale war. The Marathas besieged Salher Fort, a fortress of immense strategic value, rising high above the plains near Nashik. For the Mughals, losing Salher would mean not only a military setback, but a symbolic blow to imperial prestige, as it would signal that even in open terrain beyond the Maratha hill country, Shivaji's men could challenge imperial authority. The Mughal governor of Surat and the Subahdar of Khandesh mustered their forces. Contemporary accounts suggest that the Mughal army that marched towards Salher numbered in the tens of thousands, drawn from both imperial contingents and local levies. They carried artillery, elephants and infantry trained in the classic Mughal style, disciplined musketeers, saber-wielding cavalry and heavy siege trains. In their path, however, stood a Maratha host that was smaller in number but possessed unmatched mobility. The Marathas, under commanders like Prataprao Gujar, Morapant Pingal and others, mustered around 40,000 cavalry and infantry, supported by garrison troops already holding the nearby fortifications. Unlike the Mughal system of static encampments and elaborate baggage trains, the Marathas relied on speed. Their horses were light and hardy, able to cover vast distances in days. They carried little baggage, living off the land, striking suddenly, then vanishing before their enemy could react. The Deccan of 1672 stood at a crossroads, not just of warring armies, but of empires and ambitions. To the west, the Mughal entrepot of Surat linked India's riches with the markets of Persia and Arabia, a jewel too valuable to risk instability in the hinterlands. To the east, Berar and Telangana simmered with unrest as Mughal governors struggled to keep a grip on turbulent frontiers. Southward lingered the fading sultanates of Bijapur and Golconda, whose shifting loyalties swayed between Mughal subsidies and Maratha incursions. Meanwhile, the Portuguese at Goa and the cities of Janjira watched uneasily, knowing that whichever power emerged ascendant would dictate the fate of coastal trade and maritime raids. Amid this tense chessboard rose Salher, a mountain fortress in the Nashik hills. Its possession carried more than local importance. It symbolized control of the Baglan range and the northern approach into Maharashtra. From Aurangabad, the imperial host began its march northwest, pushing across the fertile plains of Khandesh and toward the ridges that guarded Salher. Villages along the route were compelled to surrender grain and fodder. Their stores emptied by the passing of elephants, cavalry, and endless baggage carts. Drums and kettle drums beat the measure of advance as the Mughals crossed the Godavari and pressed through the passes near Trimbak, their long columns spreading like a river of steel and dust across the land. By the time they neared Nashik, their campfires lit the valleys of the Girna and their formations stretched for miles. High in the hills, the Marathas shadowed them. Small bands harried the fords and ambushed stragglers, burning fodder stocks and vanishing into the ridges. Villagers loyal to Shivaji carried messages through forest paths, guiding Maratha scouts by torchlight. Yet this did not halt the imperial weight, which rolled forward with relentless discipline until its vanguard appeared beneath Salher's walls. Meanwhile, from Rajgad Purandar and Sinhagad, the Marathas gathered their strength. Riders swept across the Pune plain, climbed the Ghats, and descended into Khandesh. They forded the Girna and Mozam under cover of night. Their horses watered swiftly before the men pressed on. From the Satmala ridges, their banners began to mass on the approaches to Salher. Prataprao Gujar led the cavalry into position on the plain, while Morapant Pingal directed the infantry and small cannon to the rocky outcrops that commanded the field. Thus, when the Mughal columns finally deployed beneath the fortress, cavalry wings fanning outward, infantry forming ordered ranks, elephants pacing the center, they found not an empty plain, but Maratha squadrons already poised on the ridges, ready to descend in dust and thunder. The battle opened upon the Maratha left. Mughal horsemen surged forward, lances couched, their charge aimed at rolling up the flank. But the Marathas met them head-on. Riders wheeled their lighter horses with sudden agility, spears thrusting, swords flashing. Dust rose in choking clouds, hiding the men in a storm of violence. War cries pierced the din as steel clashed against steel. At the center, Mughal infantry pressed the Maratha line. Matchlocks cracked, arrows hissed, and elephants advanced, tusks gleaming. With thunderous force, they crashed into the Maratha ranks, scattering men. Yet the Marathas held. Gunners fired point-blank into the elephants. Swordsmen leapt to hack at their legs. Amid smoke and screams, beasts fell, their huge bodies blocking the advance. Hour by hour, the struggle raged. Mughal numbers pressed relentlessly, threatening to envelop the Marathas. But each time the Imperials surged forward, Maratha cavalry struck back, wheeling into the flanks, darting away before counterblows could fall. Clouds of dust rose so thick that banners vanished, soldiers fighting blind, guided only by drums and horns. By midday, the field was chaos. Horses screamed, elephants ran amok, trampling friend and foe alike. Musketeers fought hand-to-hand, their matchlocks discarded for swords. Cavalrymen, their mounts blown, dismounted to fight on foot. The plain was littered with bodies, weapons broken, and banners torn. Still, neither side gave ground. As the afternoon wore on, the Mughal wings faltered. Repeated cavalry strikes had worn them down, their horses stumbling, men gasping in the dust. The Marathas, still mobile, surged again and again, driving wedges into the enemy line. Their riders swept around, striking the Mughal rear, cutting down gunners and drivers. Morapant's cannon fired from the ridges, raining shot into the packed formations below, breaking the cohesion of the Mughal center. Through the long hours of the day, the battle became a storm of charges and countercharges. Maratha lancers darted in, stabbing, wheeling away. Mughal cavalry answered, but their strength waned. Artillery roared, smoke hung over the field, and the cries of men echoed against the hills. By late afternoon, exhaustion weighed upon both armies. Men fought knee-deep in blood and dust. The Mughal elephants, wounded and maddened, turned upon their own, crushing men beneath their feet. Imperial formations wavered. The Maratha cavalry pressed harder, their spears driving into weary ranks. Step by step, the Mughal line bent back. As the sun sank toward the horizon, the Maratha commanders gave the signal for the final assault. Cavalry swept forward in a great tide, horns and drums thundering. They struck the Mughal center, splitting the line. Panic spread as elephants broke, gunners abandoned their cannon, and soldiers fled into the gathering dusk. The Mughal host collapsed. Thousands were cut down as they ran, thousands more taken captive. The once proud army that had marched from Aurangabad dissolved into fragments, fleeing into the night. On the plain beneath Salher, the Maratha banners stood unbroken, their horsemen victorious. When the sun set over the blood-soaked plains of Salher, silence fell, where all day the earth had shaken with the thunder of hooves and cannon. The smoke lifted slowly, revealing a field strewn with the wreckage of war. The Mughal host, once 50,000 strong when it had marched from Aurangabad, now lay broken. Nearly 10,000 imperial soldiers were left dead upon the field, their bodies mingling with those of their mounts, their banners torn and trampled in the dust. Thousands more lay wounded, some crying out for aid, others sinking into silence. As the night drew on, the Marathas moved quickly to impose order upon the chaos. Victory was theirs, but their work was far from finished. Horsemen fanned out across the plain, rounding up survivors and striking down bands of fugitives who tried to flee into the ravines and forests of the Baglan range. Columns of prisoners were gathered and marched away under guard. Chroniclers recorded that nearly 20,000 men fell into Maratha hands, an immense number unprecedented in the long wars between the two powers. Among them were officers of noble birth, commanders entrusted with imperial cavalry contingents, now disarmed and forced to march in shame toward Maratha strongholds like Rajgad and Mulher. The Mughal retreat was a shattering contrast to the pomp with which they had advanced. The orderly columns that had once wound their way from Burhanpur and Aurangabad now dissolved into fugitives, each man seeking only to save himself. Abandoned lay the wagons of supplies, overturned in rocky passes where panicked men had cast them aside. Cannons were left stuck in ravines, their teams of oxen cut loose or trampled in the rout. Even elephants once painted and armored with pride were captured or killed, their bulk lying like fallen towers upon the plain. The Marathas seized the spoils with ruthless efficiency. Victorious cavalry herded the elephants back toward their own camps, repainting their foreheads with saffron and Hindu symbols. Hundreds of horses were gathered, adding to the strength of the Confederacy. Weapons littered the ground, matchlocks, swords, spears collected into piles and distributed among Maratha soldiers or sent back to forts for storage. Chests of coin, fine silks, jeweled arms, and the rich tents of Mughal officers all became the property of Shivaji's men. Never before had the Marathas captured such wealth in a single battle. For the survivors of the Mughal host, the flight westward toward Aurangabad was a nightmare. Harried at every step by Maratha riders, their columns broke apart. Some units tried to rally near Malegaon, but these too were scattered. Others attempted to cross into Khandesh, abandoning their artillery and baggage as they fled. The once proud kettle drums of the Mughal camp, symbols of imperial might, now lay silent, replaced by the ragged cries of fugitives stumbling through dust and darkness. The capture of so many Mughal officers created a diplomatic windfall. The Marathas paraded their prisoners through fortified towns, displaying them as proof of imperial weakness. Letters were dispatched to allied chiefs and village headmen across Maharashtra, recounting the triumph. The news spread rapidly, carried by word of mouth and by ballads sung in village squares. For the first time, a Maratha army had stood in open battle against a full Mughal host, and not only held the field but destroyed it. The fortress of Salher, for which the Mughals had sacrificed so much, remained firmly in Maratha hands. Its garrison, which had watched the great battle unfold from the ramparts, now joined in celebration as carts laden with captured weapons and treasure were brought within the gates. Nearby forts across the Baglan range, emboldened by the victory, raised Maratha banners, their commanders swearing renewed loyalty to Shivaji. The Mughal court at Delhi received the news with alarm. Reports of the defeat described not only the loss of thousands of soldiers, but also the capture of elephants, artillery, and noble officers. For an empire that prided itself on invincibility, the disaster at Salher was a wound to prestige as much as to power. In Aurangabad, the imperial administration scrambled to muster new forces, but the memory of the rout lingered. The imperial aura of dominance in the Deccan had been shattered. For the Marathas, the aftermath was not only military, but also symbolic. The battle had shown that they could challenge the empire in the open, not merely in raids or sieges. The sheer scale of prisoners and loot captured was proof that the balance of power had shifted. Chroniclers of the time declared Salher to be one of the greatest victories in Maratha history, and indeed, it marked a turning point in the wars of the Deccan. Even weeks after the battle, the echoes of Salher were felt across the region. Mughal attempts to regroup were met by swift Maratha raids, their cavalry emboldened by success. Convoys heading toward Burhanpur and Aurangabad were intercepted, their supplies seized. The countryside, once trembling at the sight of imperial banners, now bent willingly toward Maratha power. Village elders who had once hedged between Mughal and Maratha authority began to recognize that it was Shivaji's horsemen who now held the upper hand. The political consequences of Salher rippled far beyond the battlefield. For the first time in the Mughal-Maratha wars, the imperial army had been decisively defeated in a large, open-field engagement, a humiliation that shocked Aurangzeb's court. The emperor, who had long sought to grind down Shivaji's power through sieges and endless campaigns, now faced the reality that the Marathas could no longer be dismissed as mere raiders. Across the Deccan, Mughal garrisons found themselves isolated, their prestige shaken, and local zamindars began to hedge their loyalties, offering secret tribute to the Marathas while still professing loyalty to the emperor. For the Marathas, Salher was a turning point. The victory not only lifted their standing among the hill chiefs of Maharashtra, but also inspired confidence among potential allies farther afield. The sultanates of Bijapur and Golconda, long under Mughal pressure, saw in Shivaji's warriors a counterbalance to imperial dominance. Coastal powers from the Siddhis of Janjira to the Portuguese at Goa recalibrated their policies, wary of antagonizing a force that had just humbled the empire in open battle. In Delhi, Aurangzeb ordered fresh reinforcements to the Deccan, determined to reassert authority. Yet each new campaign drew the empire deeper into a costly war of attrition. The treasury strained under the weight of supplying vast armies, while Maratha cavalry, unburdened by heavy baggage, continued to raid imperial lines and drain imperial coffers. In the years that followed, the reverberations of Salher could still be felt in every imperial decree and frontier skirmish. The defeat forced Aurangzeb to devote ever more troops to the Deccan, sapping strength from his northern provinces and stretching logistics beyond endurance. The empire's attention turned southward, leaving the northwest vulnerable to Afghan and Persian incursions decades later. Economically, the endless campaigns drained the imperial treasury, forcing heavier taxation that bred discontent among peasants and nobles alike. Administratively, the once efficient Mughal bureaucracy began to fracture as provincial governors turned increasingly autonomous, citing the emperor's failure to protect imperial honor in the south. Meanwhile, the Marathas, emboldened by their triumph, refined their methods of warfare, shifting from mere raids to organized territorial control, laying the groundwork for the confederacy that would a century later contest dominion over all India. If you've enjoyed this journey into one of the most decisive moments of the Mughal-Maratha wars, subscribe to our channel so you never miss more incredible stories of history's greatest battles. Until next time, remember, empires rise, empires fall, but courage at the right moment can change the fate of nations.